My cousin moved into my grandmother's house to help and started charging her rent. She smiled at his court hearing. Dennis showed up at Grandma's house 3 days after Grandpa died, carrying 2 suitcases and talking about family responsibility. He told her he was worried about her living alone in that big house at 84 years old. He said he'd taken a leave from his job to come stay with her, make sure she was eating properly, help with the bills and paperwork. Grandma cried and hugged him, said he was such a good boy for thinking of her. I was there that day, had stopped by to check on her after the funeral. Dennis barely acknowledged me. He was too busy carrying his stuff into the guest room, already acting like he owned the place. Within a week, he'd moved into Grandpa's study, the room with the big oak desk and the leather chair. Said he needed a proper workspace to manage Grandma's affairs. He set up his laptop and started going through her financial documents, telling her he was organizing everything so she wouldn't have to worry. Grandma kept thanking him, kept saying what would she do without him. I visited every few days, bringing groceries and sitting with Grandma while she told stories about Grandpa. Dennis was always there, hovering in the background, inserting himself into conversations. He'd correct Grandma when she got dates wrong, remind her to take her medications in a voice that sounded helpful but felt controlling. 2 weeks after he moved in, I arrived to find Grandma upset. She was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of her, her hands shaking. Dennis was standing over her explaining something about monthly expenses and fair compensation. I asked what was going on. Dennis turned to me with this practiced smile and said he was just helping Grandma understand her financial situation. He'd calculated all the household expenses, utilities and food and maintenance, and divided them by the number of people living there. Since he was contributing to groceries and helping with chores, he explained, Grandma should only pay her portion. Her portion came to $200 a month. For her own house. The house she'd lived in for 40 years. The house she and Grandpa had paid off 15 years ago. Dennis was charging my 84-year-old grandmother rent to live in her own home. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but he just kept smiling. He said it was only fair, that he'd given up his apartment to move in and help her, that he needed to cover his own expenses. Grandma was nodding along, looking confused but trying to understand. She asked me if that sounded right, if that was how these things worked. Dennis answered before I could, said it was standard practice when adult children moved in to help aging parents. I told him he was insane, told him Grandma wasn't paying him rent in her own house. Dennis's smile faded, and he said I didn't understand the situation, that I wasn't there every day seeing how much work it took to care for her. He said if I was so concerned, maybe I should move in and help instead of just visiting. The way he said visiting made it sound like I barely cared. Grandma touched my arm and said it was all right, that Dennis was just trying to be fair, that she had the money from Grandpa's life insurance, and it made sense to contribute to the household. I looked at her and realized Dennis had already convinced her, already made her feel like she owed him something for the privilege of his presence. I told Grandma I'd come back tomorrow to talk more, shot Dennis a look that promised this wasn't over, and left before I said something I'd regret. That night, I called my sister Claire. She lived 2 states away and hadn't been able to make it to the funeral. When I told her what Dennis was doing, she went silent for a long moment. Then she said we needed to contact a lawyer because what Dennis was doing sounded like elder abuse. She said she'd start researching attorneys who specialized in these cases, told me to document everything I saw, every conversation, every change in Grandma's situation. The next day, I went back to Grandma's house with my phone ready to record if needed. Dennis was in the kitchen making breakfast, acting like the man of the house. Grandma was sitting in her recliner watching her morning shows. I sat with her and asked gently how she was feeling about the rent arrangement. She said it seemed fair, that Dennis explained it all very clearly. She said the $200 would come out of her account automatically each month starting next week. Dennis had already set up the automatic transfer. I felt my jaw clench. I asked Grandma if she'd talked to her lawyer about this, about making financial changes so soon after Grandpa died. She looked confused, said Dennis told her it wasn't necessary, that this was just a household expense arrangement, not a legal matter. I pulled out my phone and called her lawyer right there. His name was Howard Moss, and he'd handled Grandma and Grandpa's estate planning for 20 years. When I explained the situation, Howard's voice went cold. He said he'd be there in an hour and told me not to let Grandma sign anything else until he arrived. Dennis overheard the call. He came into the living room and said I was overreacting, causing unnecessary stress for Grandma. He said Howard would just confirm that everything was appropriate and charge Grandma $300 an hour for the privilege. Howard showed up 45 minutes later, a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Grandma warmly, offered his condolences again, then asked to see the financial arrangement she'd agreed to. Dennis handed over the papers with confidence, still playing the helpful grandson, just trying to do right by his grandmother. Howard read through everything slowly. The room was silent, except for the sound of paper rustling. When he finished, he set the documents on the coffee table and looked at Dennis with an expression that could freeze water. He said the arrangement was financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He said that charging an elderly person rent in their own home while claiming to be a caregiver was a form of elder abuse that could result in criminal charges. Dennis's face went red. He started arguing that he had expenses, that he'd sacrificed his own living situation to help family, that he deserved compensation for his time and effort. Howard cut him off. He said if Dennis wanted to be compensated as a caregiver, there were legal ways to structure that, with proper contracts and oversight. What Dennis had done was create a predatory arrangement that benefited him, while making Grandma believe she was obligated to pay. Howard turned to Grandma and gently explained that she owned her home outright, that she had no legal or moral obligation to pay anyone to live there, especially not family members who claimed to be helping her. Grandma's face crumpled. She looked at Dennis and asked if that was true, if he'd been taking advantage of her. Dennis tried to backtrack, said there was a misunderstanding, that he never meant to make her feel exploited. Howard wasn't having it. He told Dennis he had 24 hours to move out of the house. Dennis laughed, and said Howard couldn't force him to leave. This was a family matter, and he was staying to care for his grandmother whether we liked it or not. Howard pulled out his phone and made a call. 10 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. Howard explained the situation, showed them the documents Dennis had created, and explained that this constituted elder financial abuse under state law. The officers told Dennis he needed to gather his essential belongings and leave the premises immediately. Dennis exploded, started yelling about his rights, about how he'd given up everything to be there, about how ungrateful we all were. One officer told him to calm down or he'd be arrested for disturbing the peace. Grandma was crying now, saying she didn't want trouble, that maybe everyone should just calm down. I sat next to her and held her hand while Dennis packed. He moved through the house, grabbing his things, slamming drawers and muttering under his breath. When he passed me, he stopped and said, "I'd regret this, that I was turning Grandma against family." I told him to get out. After Dennis left, Howard sat with us and explained what needed to happen next. He said we should file for a protective order to keep Dennis away from Grandma. He said we needed to review all of Grandma's financial accounts to make sure Dennis hadn't taken anything else. He said he'd work with us to make sure Grandma's assets were properly protected. The next week was a blur of meetings and paperwork. We discovered Dennis had taken $3,400 from Grandma's checking account beyond the rent payment, claiming he needed it for household expenses. Bank records showed he'd used her debit card at restaurants, electronics, stores, and online gambling sites. Howard filed a police report for financial exploitation and theft. We got the protective order approved, legally barring Dennis from coming within 500 feet of Grandma or her property. Claire flew in and stayed for 2 weeks, helping Grandma process what had happened. Grandma kept saying she couldn't believe Dennis would do this, that his mother, her daughter, would be heartbroken if she knew. Dennis's mother, Aunt Linda, had died 5 years ago from cancer. Grandma had helped pay for her medical treatments, had been there every day during her final months. Dennis had barely visited his own mother during that time, always had excuses about work or other obligations. I spent those 2 weeks digging deeper into Dennis's background. Something about his sudden appearance felt calculated, and I needed to know if this was a pattern. I called my Uncle Frank, Aunt Linda's brother, who lived across the country. Frank had always been straightforward, never one to sugarcoat family dysfunction. When I asked about Dennis, Frank sighed heavily. He told me that Dennis had tried something similar with his own father 3 years ago. Frank's dad had been recovering from a stroke, and Dennis had shown up offering to help manage his care. Within a month, Dennis had convinced the old man to add him to his bank accounts for easier bill paying. Frank discovered Dennis had withdrawn $12,000 before he caught it and threatened to press charges. Dennis had paid back $4,000 and disappeared. Frank's father had been too embarrassed to pursue it further. The stroke had affected his judgment, and he blamed himself for trusting Dennis. He died 6 months later, and Dennis hadn't even come to the funeral. Hearing this made my blood run cold. Dennis was a predator with a system, targeting elderly family members during their most vulnerable moments. I asked Frank if he'd be willing to provide a statement about what happened with his father. Frank said absolutely, said he'd wished he'd done more at the time to stop Dennis permanently. I contacted 2 other cousins on Aunt Linda's side of the family. Both had stories about Dennis borrowing money and never paying it back, about him showing up during family crises and somehow leaving with cash or valuables. One cousin, Julie, told me about how Dennis had taken their grandmother's jewelry box during the confusion after her funeral, claiming Aunt Linda had promised him he could have it. The jewelry was never recovered. Another cousin, Robert, said Dennis had stolen his identity 7 years ago, opening credit cards in his name and racking up $8,000 in debt before Robert discovered it. Robert had pressed charges, and Dennis had done 6 months of probation for identity theft. That conviction was on his record, which explained why he'd had trouble keeping jobs. I compiled all of this information and gave it to Howard. He said it established a clear pattern of behavior that would be useful if Dennis tried to fight back legally. He also said it made him sick that someone could systematically target their own family members. Howard had been practicing law for 35 years and said he'd seen a lot of financial elder abuse, but it was usually strangers or distant acquaintances, not direct family members with this level of calculation. 3 weeks after we kicked him out, Dennis filed a lawsuit. He claimed Grandma had verbally promised him ownership of the house in exchange for his caretaking. He said he'd left his job and apartment based on this promise, and now he was seeking compensation for his sacrifices. The lawsuit demanded $150,000 plus the deed to the house. Howard called me the day he received the filing. His voice was tight with anger. He said Dennis was lying, that there was no evidence of any such promise, that this was a desperate attempt to get money after being caught exploiting Grandma. But he also said we needed to take it seriously because lawsuits could drain resources even when they were baseless. The legal fees alone could cost tens of thousands. I asked what we should do. Howard said he was already preparing a countersuit for the money Dennis had stolen, and that we should let the legal process play out. He said truth and documentation were on our side, but I could hear the concern in his voice. Frivolous lawsuits could take years to resolve, and Grandma didn't have years to spend fighting this battle. I started documenting everything, retroactively. I went through my phone and found texts Dennis had sent during his time at Grandma's house, messages where he complained about being there, about Grandma being forgetful, about wanting to get back to his real life. Nothing in any message suggested he believed he was earning ownership of the property. Claire did the same, found emails Dennis had sent her asking for money, claiming he was broke and needed help with rent at his old apartment. The dates proved he'd been lying about giving up his apartment to move in with Grandma. He'd been evicted for non-payment 3 months before Grandpa died and had nowhere else to go. That's why he'd showed up at Grandma's house with his suitcases. It was never about helping her. We gave everything to Howard. He compiled a file that painted a clear picture of Dennis as an opportunistic predator who'd targeted a grieving widow. Howard also interviewed Grandma extensively, documenting her mental state, her clarity about her own wishes, and her consistent statement that she'd never promised Dennis anything except gratitude for helping around the house. During one of these interviews, Grandma mentioned something that made Howard sit up straighter. She said that about a week into Dennis's stay, he'd asked her to sign some papers. He'd told her they were just updated emergency contact forms in case something happened to her. She'd signed them without reading carefully because Dennis said they were routine. Howard asked if she still had copies. She didn't, but she remembered Dennis making photocopies on the printer in Grandpa's study. We went to the study and searched through everything. In the back of a filing cabinet, we found a folder Dennis had labeled Household Documents. Inside were the papers Grandma had signed. They weren't emergency contact forms. They were quitclaim deed transfer documents that would have signed over 50% ownership of the house to Dennis. The documents were incomplete, missing notarization and county filing. But the intent was clear. Dennis had tried to trick Grandma into signing over her house. Howard photographed everything and added it to our case file. He said this was attempted fraud and significantly strengthened our position. He also said it showed premeditation, that Dennis had come to Grandma's house with these documents already prepared. This wasn't an opportunistic scam, it was a calculated attack. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 months out. During that time, Dennis tried to contact Grandma 3 times despite the protective order, once through a mutual relative who didn't know about the situation. Dennis had called his Aunt Beverly, Grandma's sister, crying about how he'd been unfairly kicked out and his grandmother wouldn't talk to him. Beverly had called Grandma concerned, and Grandma had to explain the whole situation. Beverly was horrified and immediately cut off contact with Dennis. The second attempt was at church. Grandma attended services every Sunday at the same small church she'd gone to for 40 years. Dennis knew this. He showed up one Sunday and tried to approach her in the parking lot after service. Several church members who knew about the situation formed a barrier around Grandma and told Dennis to leave. The church pastor, Reverend Michael Stone, told Dennis he wasn't welcome there anymore and needed to go. Dennis started yelling about Christian forgiveness and family loyalty. Reverend Stone said forgiveness didn't mean allowing abuse to continue and called the police. Dennis left before they arrived, but the incident was documented as a protective order violation. The third attempt was a letter. It arrived in Grandma's mailbox, a handwritten envelope with no return address. Inside was a 6-page letter from Dennis. The first page was apologies, saying he understood he'd made mistakes and just wanted to make things right. The second page shifted to guilt, reminding Grandma of how much his mother had loved her, how disappointed Aunt Linda would be to see the family torn apart. The third page turned angry, accusing me and Claire of manipulating Grandma against him, claiming we were after her money and had poisoned her mind. The fourth page was threats, vaguely worded but clear in intent, suggesting that if Grandma didn't drop the charges and let him back in, she might not be safe living alone. The fifth page was more manipulation, talking about how fragile she was, how she needed him, how the stress of this conflict could kill her. The sixth page was a contract he wanted her to sign, agreeing to drop all charges and pay him $50,000 to go away permanently. We gave the letter to Howard and reported it as another protective order violation. This time, the police took it more seriously. The threats, however vague, constituted harassment and intimidation. A detective named Olivia Chen was assigned to the case. She came to Grandma's house and interviewed her about all 3 contact attempts. Detective Chen said Dennis's behavior was escalating and suggested we install security cameras around the property. She also said Dennis would likely be arrested for the violations and his bail conditions would be strengthened. Dennis was arrested 3 days later at the apartment he'd moved into after leaving Grandma's house. He spent 2 nights in jail before his bail hearing. His bail was set at $10,000, and his conditions included wearing a GPS ankle monitor, mandatory anger management classes, and absolute prohibition from any contact with Grandma, direct or indirect. He also had to stay at least 1,000 feet from her house and her church. His lawyer, a public defender at this point since Dennis couldn't afford private counsel, tried to argue that Dennis was being persecuted for a family dispute. The judge wasn't sympathetic. She said 3 protective order violations showed a pattern of harassment that justified the strict conditions. During this time, I hired a private investigator named Russell Grant. I wanted to know everything about Dennis's current situation, whether he was working, where he was getting money, if he had any assets we could recover. Russell was a retired cop with 30 years of experience and a network of contacts throughout the city. Within a week, he had a comprehensive report. Dennis was unemployed, as expected. He was living in a subsidized apartment and receiving food stamps. He had no vehicle, no bank accounts with more than $200, and was behind on his child support payments from a marriage that had ended 8 years ago. That was news to us. None of us knew Dennis had been married or that he had a kid. Russell provided the ex-wife's contact information and suggested I reach out to her. Her name was Bethany Wolfe, and she lived 3 hours away. I called Bethany and introduced myself, explained who I was and why I was contacting her. There was a long pause. Then she asked if Dennis had done something to my family. I said yes, and asked if she'd be willing to talk about her experiences with him. She agreed immediately, said she'd been waiting years for someone from his family to ask questions about him. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our cities. Bethany was a thin woman in her late 30s with tired eyes and nervous hands. She ordered tea, and then told me about her marriage to Dennis. They'd met when she was 22 and he was 24. He'd been charming at first, attentive and funny, but after they got married, things changed. He couldn't keep a job, always had excuses for why he'd been fired, or why the workplace was toxic. She worked 2 jobs to support them while he stayed home, supposedly looking for work, but actually playing video games and gambling online. When she got pregnant, he seemed excited at first, but after their daughter Kayla was born, he became resentful of the attention Bethany gave the baby. He started taking money from Bethany's wallet, small amounts at first, then larger sums. He opened credit cards in her name without telling her and maxed them out. By the time Kayla was 2, they were $40,000 in debt, all of it created by Dennis. Bethany finally left him when she came home early from work and found Dennis trying to pawn her grandmother's wedding ring. She filed for divorce and got a restraining order after he showed up at her workplace multiple times, trying to convince her to come back. The divorce was finalized 8 years ago. Dennis was supposed to pay $400 a month in child support, but rarely did. He was currently $28,000 behind in payments. Bethany had given up trying to collect because every attempt just brought him back into her life, and she wanted him gone. She asked how old my grandmother was. When I told her, Bethany's expression turned dark. She said Dennis specifically targeted vulnerable people, that it was a pattern she'd recognized too late in their marriage. She told me about how Dennis had befriended an elderly neighbor during their marriage, an old man named Albert who lived alone. Dennis had started helping Albert with yard work and errands. Within 6 months, Dennis had convinced Albert to loan him $5,000 for a business investment that never materialized. When Albert asked for the money back, Dennis cut off all contact. Albert had been too proud to report it. Bethany said she'd tried to pay Albert back after the divorce, small amounts when she could afford it, but Albert had died before she could repay the full amount. She'd felt guilty about it ever since. I asked if she'd be willing to testify about Dennis's character and pattern of financial abuse. She said absolutely, said she wanted to make sure he didn't destroy anyone else's life. I gave her Howard's contact information and she promised to call him. As we left the coffee shop, Bethany stopped me and said she hoped my grandmother was okay, that she was stronger than Bethany had been when dealing with Dennis. I told her my grandmother was a fighter. Bethany smiled sadly and said she wished she'd met someone from Dennis's family years ago who would have believed her. Howard interviewed Bethany the following week and added her testimony to our case file. He said her story corroborated everything we'd documented and showed that Dennis's behavior with Grandma wasn't an isolated incident but part of a lifelong pattern. He also tracked down Albert's family and found Albert's son, who confirmed the story about the $5,000 loan and said his father had been too embarrassed to press charges. Albert's son was willing to provide a written statement. The case file was now over 300 pages, documenting every aspect of Dennis's predatory behavior. During these months of preparation, I moved in with Grandma full-time. I converted the guest room into my bedroom and set up a home office so I could work remotely. Claire visited every other week, staying for long weekends, and we developed a routine of care that kept Grandma comfortable and secure. She started sleeping better once the security cameras were installed, and she could see that Dennis wasn't lurking around the property. But she still had moments of anxiety, times when a car would drive slowly past the house and she'd tense up, or when the phone would ring from an unknown number and she'd refuse to answer. The trauma of what Dennis had done, the betrayal by someone she'd trusted and loved, had left marks that wouldn't fade quickly. Her church community rallied around her. Members brought meals, invited her to social events, and made sure she knew she wasn't alone. Reverend Stone visited weekly, sitting with her and talking about forgiveness, not of Dennis's actions, but of her own self-blame for not seeing his intentions sooner. Grandma kept saying she should have known, should have seen the signs, should have been smarter. Reverend Stone told her that predators were skilled at hiding their true nature, that she wasn't foolish for trusting family, that trust was a virtue, and Dennis had exploited it. Those conversations helped, but I could see Grandma still carried guilt. One evening, about 4 months after Dennis had been kicked out, Grandma and I were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. She said something that broke my heart. She said she felt like she'd failed Aunt Linda. She'd promised her daughter during those final cancer treatments that she'd look after Dennis, make sure he was okay after Linda was gone. She felt like, by prosecuting Dennis and cutting him out of the family, she was breaking that promise. I didn't know what to say at first. Then I told her that looking after someone didn't mean enabling them to hurt people. That the best thing anyone could do for Dennis was to hold him accountable for his actions, force him to face consequences, and hope that maybe it would push him to change. I told her that Aunt Linda would have wanted Dennis to be a good person, not just a person who was protected from his own bad choices. Grandma cried and said she hoped I was right. The hearing date arrived on a gray morning in November. We'd been preparing for 6 months, and now it was finally here. Grandma had barely slept the night before. She'd laid out her navy blue dress, the one with pearl buttons that Grandpa had loved, and spent an hour doing her hair and makeup. She wanted to look strong, she said, wanted Dennis to see that he hadn't broken her. Howard met us at the courthouse steps. He was carrying a large briefcase filled with documentation and had his paralegal, a young woman, named Simone Park, with him to help manage the evidence. We went through security and found the courtroom. Dennis was already there with his lawyer. He'd managed to hire private counsel after all, a guy named Troy Vega who specialized in estate disputes and had a reputation for taking questionable cases if the potential payout was high enough. Troy was in his 40s, expensive suit, slicked back hair, and the kind of smile that looked practiced in a mirror. Dennis had gained weight since I'd last seen him. His suit was wrinkled and his tie was crooked. He looked tired and defeated already, but when he saw us walk in, his expression hardened into something ugly. He said something to Troy, who glanced at us and then whispered back. Claire arrived 10 minutes later. She'd flown in the day before and stayed at a hotel near the courthouse. She sat on my other side, and the three of us formed a protective barrier around Grandma. The courtroom filled with other people involved in various cases scheduled that morning. Frank was there, my uncle who'd told me about Dennis's attempt to scam his father. Julie and Robert were there too, the cousins who'd provided statements about their experiences with Dennis. And in the back row, I saw Bethany Wolfe sitting quietly, ready to testify if needed. The bailiff called court to order, and Judge Angela Ramirez entered. She was a woman in her 50s with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and an expression that suggested she had no patience for nonsense. She reviewed the case file, asked a few preliminary questions, then told Troy to present his opening statement. Troy stood and launched into a speech about family duty and moral obligations. He painted Dennis as a devoted grandson who'd sacrificed his career and housing to care for an ailing grandmother. He talked about verbal agreements and family understandings, about how Dennis had given up months of his life based on promises that were now being denied. He described Dennis as the victim of a family conspiracy led by manipulative relatives who wanted Grandma's estate for themselves. He never mentioned the rent Dennis had charged. He never mentioned the stolen money. He never mentioned the attempted fraud with the quitclaim deed. He presented a sanitized version of events that bore no resemblance to reality. When Troy finished, Judge Ramirez looked unimpressed. She turned to Howard and asked for his response. Howard stood slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but carried weight. He said he wouldn't waste the court's time with elaborate stories. He said the facts spoke for themselves, and he'd let the evidence do the talking. Then he began systematically presenting the case. First, he showed the rental agreement Dennis had created, the document demanding $200 monthly from an 84-year-old widow in her own paid-off home. He entered it as evidence and provided the court with copies. Judge Ramirez examined it, her expression darkening. Next, Howard presented bank records showing the $300-400 Dennis had stolen, complete with transaction details showing purchases at restaurants, electronics stores, and gambling sites. He showed Dennis's pattern of spending Grandma's money while claiming it was for household expenses. Then came the attempted quitclaim deed fraud, the papers Dennis had tried to trick Grandma into signing. Howard explained how Dennis had misrepresented the documents as emergency contact forms while actually attempting to transfer ownership of the house. Judge Ramirez's expression went from dark to thunderous. She asked Troy if he'd been aware of these documents. Troy stammered that he'd been told they were a misunderstanding, that Dennis had been trying to help his grandmother organize her estate paperwork. Howard didn't pause. He moved on to the protective order violations, presenting evidence of all 3 attempts Dennis had made to contact Grandma, despite legal prohibition. The letter with its threats and demand for $50,000 was entered as evidence. Judge Ramirez read it fully, and I saw her jaw tighten. Then, Howard began calling witnesses. First was Frank, who testified about Dennis's attempt to scam his father 3 years ago, the $12,000 theft and the pattern of targeting elderly family members. Troy tried to object, claiming it was irrelevant to the current case, but Judge Ramirez overruled him. She said pattern evidence was absolutely relevant when determining credibility and intent. Next was Julie, who described the stolen jewelry after their grandmother's funeral. Then Robert, who explained the identity theft and credit card fraud from 7 years ago. Troy objected again, arguing that a conviction from 7 years ago shouldn't be admissible. Judge Ramirez disagreed. She said it established a documented history of financial crimes and was directly relevant to the current claims. Then Bethany took the stand. Howard asked her to describe her marriage to Dennis and the financial abuse she'd experienced. She spoke quietly but clearly, detailing the debt Dennis had created, the money he'd stolen, the elderly neighbor he'd scammed. Troy cross-examined her aggressively, trying to suggest she was a bitter ex-wife making up stories. Bethany didn't flinch. She calmly pointed out that everything she'd said was documented in court records from their divorce, in credit reports, in police reports from when Dennis had violated the restraining order. Troy had no response to that. Detective Chen testified next. She described the 3 protective order violations and Dennis's escalating behavior. She characterized his actions as harassment and intimidation of an elderly victim. She also noted that Dennis had been arrested multiple times for failure to appear at court hearings related to his child support case, showing a pattern of avoiding legal accountability. Then Howard called Grandma to the stand. This was the moment I'd been dreading. Grandma walked slowly to the witness stand, and the bailiff helped her up the steps. She was sworn in, her voice steady but quiet. Howard approached gently and asked her to state her name and age. She did. He asked how long she'd lived in her house. She said 40 years, that she and Grandpa had bought it when their children were young. Howard asked her to describe what happened after Grandpa died. Grandma took a breath and began talking. She described Dennis showing up with suitcases, his claims about wanting to help her, how grateful she'd felt to have family there during her grief. She described how Dennis had gradually taken over, moving into Grandpa's study, going through financial documents, making decisions without consulting her. She described the day Dennis presented her with the rental agreement, how confused she'd been, how he'd made it sound reasonable and necessary. Her voice cracked when she described signing the papers for what she thought were emergency contact forms, only to later learn they were an attempt to steal half her house. Howard asked if she'd ever promised Dennis ownership of the property. She said no, absolutely not, never. She said she'd thanked him for helping but had never suggested he'd inherit anything. Howard asked how she felt about what Dennis had done. Grandma was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. Then she looked directly at Dennis for the first time since entering the courtroom. She said she'd loved him, had tried to help his mother when she was dying, had given Dennis money over the years whenever he said he needed it. She said she'd welcomed him into her home during the worst time of her life because she believed he cared about her. She said discovering he'd been using her grief to steal from her was devastating. She said it was the second worst thing that had happened to her after losing her husband. Her voice broke on the last words and she started crying. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of her quiet sobs. Howard gave her a moment, then asked if she had any other comments. Grandma wiped her eyes and said she'd spent 6 months wondering what she'd done wrong, what signs she'd missed, how she'd been so foolish. She said therapy had helped her understand she wasn't foolish, that trust wasn't a weakness, that Dennis had exploited something good in her. She said she didn't want other families to go through this, that if her testimony could help protect other elderly people from predators, then the pain of reliving it was worth it. Howard thanked her and returned to his seat. Troy stood for cross-examination. He started by asking about Grandma's age and whether she took any medications that might affect her memory. Howard immediately objected, and Judge Ramirez sustained it. She told Troy that medical records submitted by Grandma's doctor already established her complete mental competency, and that this line of questioning was inappropriate. Troy shifted tactics. He asked if Grandma had ever told Dennis he was like a son to her. Grandma said yes. She'd said that many times over the years. Troy asked if she'd ever told Dennis the house would stay in the family. She said yes. She'd always planned to leave it to her children and grandchildren. Troy seized on this, suggesting that Dennis had reasonably interpreted these statements as promises of inheritance. Grandma cut him off. She said telling someone they're loved and saying property will stay in the family was not the same as promising to sign over the house to one person while she was still alive. She said Dennis knew the difference and had deliberately twisted her words. Troy tried to press further, but Grandma wasn't backing down. She said she might be old, but she wasn't stupid, and she knew when someone was trying to confuse her. Judge Ramirez looked almost amused. She told Troy to move on or finish his cross-examination. Troy had no more questions. Grandma stepped down from the witness stand and returned to her seat between Claire and me. She was trembling, but held her head high. Howard called his final witness, a forensic accountant named Donald Lewis, who'd reviewed all of Grandma's financial records. Donald testified that Dennis's claims of contributing to household expenses were false. The bank records showed Dennis had contributed nothing. Every purchase, every utility payment, every expense had been paid by Grandma. Dennis had taken money, but never given any. Donald calculated that including the rent, the stolen $3,400, and the value of goods and services Dennis had consumed during his 6 weeks in the house, he'd extracted approximately $8,700 from Grandma. Troy tried to argue that some of those expenses were normal costs of living together, but Donald systematically dismantled every claim. He showed that before Dennis arrived, Grandma's monthly expenses averaged $100. During Dennis's stay, they jumped to $2,400 monthly. The increase was entirely due to Dennis's spending. After Donald's testimony, Howard rested his case. Judge Ramirez asked Troy if he had any witnesses to present. Troy called Dennis to the stand. This was risky, and I could see Troy knew it, but he didn't have much choice. Dennis was sworn in and took his seat. He looked nervous, his hands gripping the armrests. Troy asked him to describe his relationship with Grandma before Grandpa died. Dennis talked about visiting occasionally, helping with yard work sometimes, being part of family gatherings. Nothing he said suggested a particularly close relationship. Troy asked why he decided to move in after Grandpa died. Dennis said he was worried about Grandma being alone, that families should take care of each other. Troy asked about the rental arrangement. Dennis said he thought it was fair compensation for his time and effort. He said he'd given up his apartment and his job to be there, and he needed to cover his costs. Troy asked about the quitclaim deed papers. Dennis claimed he'd been trying to help Grandma organize her estate planning, and had gotten confused about the correct forms. It was a weak explanation, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Howard stood for cross-examination. He asked Dennis point blank if he'd been evicted from his apartment before moving in with Grandma. Dennis hesitated, then admitted yes. Howard asked if Dennis had lied to Grandma about giving up his apartment to help her. Dennis said it wasn't lying, it was simplifying the situation. Judge Ramirez interrupted and told Dennis to answer yes or no. Dennis said yes. Howard asked if Dennis had told Grandma he'd taken a leave from his job. Dennis said yes. Howard asked if that was true. Dennis said he'd been between jobs. Howard asked if Dennis had been unemployed for 8 months before moving into Grandma's house. Dennis admitted yes. Howard asked if Dennis had ever disclosed his criminal conviction for identity theft. Dennis said it hadn't come up. Howard asked if Dennis had intentionally hidden it. Dennis said he didn't think it was relevant. Howard pulled out a copy of Dennis's child support records and asked if he was aware he was $28,000 behind in payments to his daughter. Troy objected, claiming it was irrelevant. Judge Ramirez overruled him. She said character and financial responsibility were absolutely relevant to this case. Dennis admitted he was behind on child support. Howard asked if Dennis had used any of the money he'd taken from Grandma to pay his child support obligations. Dennis said no. Howard asked where that money had gone. Dennis said he'd had expenses. Howard asked him to be specific. Dennis couldn't provide specifics. Howard showed him the bank records with charges at casinos and electronics stores. He asked if those were the expenses Dennis meant. Dennis said he'd needed to relax and decompress from the stress of caregiving. Howard asked what caregiving tasks Dennis had actually performed. Dennis described making meals and helping Grandma remember her medications. Howard asked if Dennis had medical training. Dennis said no. Howard asked if Dennis had researched proper caregiving techniques. Dennis said he'd used common sense. Howard asked if Dennis thought common sense included charging an 84-year-old widow rent in her own home. Dennis said he'd already explained that was about fair compensation. Howard asked if Dennis thought common sense included stealing $3,400. Dennis said he hadn't stolen anything, he'd taken reimbursement for expenses. Howard showed him the bank records again, line by line, asking Dennis to explain how gambling charges were household expenses. Dennis couldn't. He started getting defensive, his voice rising. Howard asked about the letter Dennis had sent to Grandma despite the protective order. Dennis said he'd just been trying to communicate. Howard read aloud the section of the letter where Dennis had implied Grandma might not be safe living alone. He asked if Dennis had intended that as a threat. Dennis said no, he was just concerned about her safety. Howard asked if threatening someone's safety was an appropriate way to show concern. Dennis said he hadn't threatened anyone. Howard asked Judge Ramirez to review the letter herself and determine if it contained threatening language. She did, reading it carefully, and said it clearly contained implied threats. She asked Dennis if he understood that sending threatening letters to elderly victims while under a protective order was a crime. Dennis's face went white. He stammered that he hadn't meant it as a threat. Judge Ramirez said intent was irrelevant when the language was clearly threatening. She said she was making a note of this for the district attorney's office. Troy tried to salvage the situation by asking Dennis about his intentions when he moved in with Grandma. Dennis said he genuinely wanted to help. Troy asked if Dennis had ever intended to hurt or exploit Grandma. Dennis said absolutely not. But the damage was done. Dennis's testimony had been a disaster. Howard had systematically exposed every lie, every manipulation, every criminal action. Troy had no more questions, and Dennis was dismissed. Judge Ramirez said she'd heard enough and was ready to rule. She didn't need to deliberate or review anything further. The facts were clear and unambiguous. She said Dennis's lawsuit was not only without merit, but was itself an act of continued abuse against an elderly victim. She said the evidence showed a clear pattern of predatory behavior, financial exploitation, and deliberate targeting of vulnerable family members. She dismissed Dennis's case with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. She granted our countersuit in full, ordering Dennis to repay the $3,400 he'd stolen plus an additional $15,000 in punitive damages. She ordered Dennis to pay all of Grandma's legal fees, which had reached $22,000. Judge Ramirez looked directly at Dennis and said his behavior was reprehensible. She said he'd targeted his own grandmother during her time of greatest vulnerability and grief. She said he'd violated the basic trust that should exist within families. She said his actions demonstrated a complete lack of moral character and empathy. She said she was referring his case to the district attorney for prosecution on charges of elder financial abuse, fraud, theft, and violation of protective orders. She recommended the maximum sentence allowed by law. She also said she was recommending Dennis be added to the state's elder abuse registry, which would permanently bar him from working in caregiving positions or having financial access to vulnerable adults. His name would be publicly searchable, a permanent record of what he'd done. Dennis's face had gone from white to red. He looked like he might be sick. Troy put a hand on his arm, but Dennis shook it off. Judge Ramirez wasn't finished. She said that based on the evidence of threatening behavior and multiple protective order violations, she was extending the protective order indefinitely. Dennis was permanently barred from contacting Grandma in any way, directly or indirectly. He was permanently barred from coming within 1,000 feet of her home, her church, or any location she regularly frequented. Violation would result in immediate arrest and prosecution. She also ordered Dennis to continue wearing the GPS ankle monitor until completion of any criminal proceedings. Court was adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. We sat there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Grandma was crying, but these were tears of relief. Claire hugged her from one side and I hugged her from the other. Howard leaned over and said Grandma had been incredibly brave. He said her testimony had been powerful and had clearly influenced the judge's decision. As we gathered our things, I looked over at Dennis. He was still sitting at his table with his head in his hands. Troy was packing his briefcase, his expression neutral but his movements quick, someone who wanted to get away from a losing case. Other people from the courtroom were leaving, but several stopped to speak to us. Frank hugged Grandma and said he was proud of her. Julie and Robert did the same. Bethany approached hesitantly and asked if she could speak to Grandma. I nodded and stepped back slightly. Bethany said she wanted Grandma to know she wasn't alone, that what Dennis had done to her, he'd done to others, but Grandma had been strong enough to fight back. She said Grandma's courage might help others in the future, that when cases like this were prosecuted successfully, it set precedent and encouraged other victims to come forward. Grandma thanked her and said she was sorry for what Bethany had endured during her marriage. Bethany said she was just glad to see Dennis finally being held accountable. Then Grandma did something unexpected. She walked over to Dennis's table. I started to follow, concerned about what might happen, but Howard touched my arm and shook his head. He whispered to let her do this. We watched as Grandma stood in front of her grandson, the man who'd tried to steal her home and her dignity, the man who'd exploited her grief for financial gain. Dennis looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. He started to say something, but Grandma held up her hand and he went silent. She didn't speak. She didn't yell or cry or make accusations. She just stood there for 5 seconds and smiled at him. It wasn't a cruel smile or a triumphant one. It was the saddest smile I'd ever seen, full of disappointment and pity and the death of whatever affection she'd once held for him. It was a smile that said she saw exactly who he was now, all pretense stripped away, and she felt sorry for him. Sorry that he'd become someone capable of this. Sorry that he'd wasted whatever potential he'd once had. Sorry that he'd destroyed every relationship that had ever mattered. She held that smile for 5 seconds that felt like an eternity, then turned and walked back to us. Dennis put his head back in his hands. We left the courthouse and went to lunch at Grandma's favorite restaurant downtown, a small Italian place called Benedetto's, where she and Grandpa had celebrated their anniversary every year. The owner, Mr. Castellano, had known them for decades. When we walked in, he immediately came over and hugged Grandma. He'd heard about what happened with Dennis through the community gossip network and wanted her to know the meal was on the house. We sat at a corner booth and ordered. Grandma got her favorite chicken parmesan and actually ate the entire plate, the first time I'd seen her finish a full meal in months. She talked about Grandpa, about how he would have handled Dennis. She said Grandpa had never trusted Dennis even as a kid, had always said there was something off about him. She laughed, remembering one Christmas when Dennis was 14 and had stolen money from the gift envelopes meant for other family members. Grandpa had caught him and made him return every dollar and apologize to everyone. Dennis had cried and promised he'd never steal again. Grandpa had said people don't change their core nature, they just get better at hiding it. Grandma said she should have listened. After lunch, we drove her home. The house felt different somehow, lighter. The oppressive weight of Dennis's lawsuit, the constant anxiety about what might happen, had been lifted. Claire and I stayed with Grandma for the rest of the day, just sitting with her, watching old movies, being present. That evening, Howard called. The district attorney's office had already reviewed Judge Ramirez's referral and decided to prosecute Dennis. They were filing charges the next day and expected Dennis to be arrested within a week. Howard said the evidence was overwhelming and the DA was confident about securing a conviction. He also said several news outlets had picked up the story. Elder financial abuse cases were becoming more common and prosecutors were using high-profile cases to raise public awareness. Howard asked if Grandma would be willing to speak to a reporter from the local news station. She said yes. The interview aired 3 days later. Grandma sat in her living room and calmly described what Dennis had done. She talked about how predators target elderly people during times of grief and vulnerability. She talked about the importance of family members watching out for warning signs. She urged anyone experiencing similar situations to contact Adult Protective Services or elder abuse hotlines. The reporter asked how she felt about Dennis now. Grandma said she felt sad for him, that he'd chosen a path that destroyed relationships and hurt people, that she hoped someday he'd understand the damage he'd caused and try to become better. But she also said she couldn't have him in her life anymore, that protecting herself wasn't cruel, it was necessary. The interview generated significant community response. Adult Protective Services reported a spike in calls from families concerned about elderly relatives. 3 other families came forward with complaints about Dennis, describing times he'd borrowed money or taken items and never returned them. The mounting evidence painted an even clearer picture of someone who'd spent his entire adult life exploiting others. Dennis was arrested on a Friday afternoon. He was charged with elder financial abuse, attempted fraud, theft, and 4 counts of violating protective orders. His bail was set at $50,000, which he couldn't afford. He stayed in jail for 2 weeks before a bail bondsman agreed to post bond in exchange for his truck, which Dennis apparently still owned, despite having no legal income. While Dennis awaited trial, we focused on helping Grandma heal. She started attending a support group for elder abuse victims at the community center. The group met weekly and was facilitated by a social worker named Rita Guzman. Grandma said talking to other people who'd experienced similar situations helped her feel less alone and less foolish. She made friends there, women and men who understood what she'd been through without needing detailed explanations. One man in his 70s had been scammed by his own son, who'd taken $80,000 from his retirement accounts. A woman in her 80s had been financially exploited by a caregiver hired through an agency. Their stories were all different but shared common themes of betrayal, manipulation, and the difficult process of recovery. Claire and I also made changes to Grandma's financial situation to protect her going forward. With her permission and working with Howard, we set up a trust that managed her assets. I became the trustee, with Claire as backup. The arrangement meant Grandma could access her money for daily needs, but large withdrawals or financial decisions required my approval. It wasn't about controlling her, but about creating a barrier against future exploitation. We also set up automatic bill payments for all her utilities and regular expenses, so she didn't have to worry about managing multiple payments. We created a detailed budget that tracked her income and spending, not to restrict her, but to ensure transparency. Grandma was involved in every decision and approved every change. She said having these protections in place made her feel secure rather than infantilized. Dennis's trial was scheduled for 8 months after his arrest. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, despite the overwhelming evidence. His new attorney, another public defender named Felicity Brennan, tried to negotiate a plea deal. The DA's office offered to drop 2 of the protective order violation charges if Dennis pleaded guilty to the elder abuse and theft charges. He refused, apparently convinced he could somehow win at trial. The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution presented the same evidence we'd seen at the civil hearing, plus additional testimony from other people. Dennis had scammed over the years. The defense tried to paint Dennis as a well-meaning person who'd made mistakes in judgment but hadn't intended to harm anyone. The jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for 3 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. During that time, we received a letter from Dennis. It arrived at Howard's office, not at Grandma's house, which suggested Dennis was at least smart enough not to violate the protective order again. The letter was addressed to Grandma, and Howard called to ask if she wanted to read it. She said yes. I drove to Howard's office and picked up the letter. It was 2 pages, handwritten. I read it first, wanting to screen for anything threatening or manipulative. The letter started with an apology. Dennis said he was sorry for what he'd done, that he'd been desperate and made terrible choices. He said he knew sorry wasn't enough, but wanted her to know he regretted everything. The second page shifted tone. He talked about his childhood, about feeling like he'd never lived up to expectations, about struggling financially his entire adult life. He said watching other people succeed while he failed had made him angry and resentful. He said he'd justified his actions by telling himself he deserved compensation for his suffering. He acknowledged this was wrong and that he'd hurt innocent people. He ended by saying he didn't expect forgiveness but hoped Grandma could eventually find peace. I showed the letter to Grandma. She read it slowly, then folded it and set it aside. She said it was good that Dennis was acknowledging what he'd done, but words were easy. She'd believe he'd changed if he spent the next decade living differently, treating people with respect, taking responsibility for his daughter and his debts. Until then, it was just another manipulation, trying to make her feel sorry for him. She was probably right. The sentencing hearing arrived on a cloudy morning in April. Judge Ramirez presided again. The prosecution recommended the maximum sentence, 4 years in state prison, given the severity of the crimes and Dennis's pattern of behavior. The defense asked for probation and community service, arguing that prison would destroy Dennis's chances of rehabilitation. Character witnesses spoke on both sides. Dennis's Aunt Beverly, who'd initially contacted Grandma on his behalf, testified that Dennis had shown remorse and was attending therapy. The prosecution countered with testimony from multiple victims, including Bethany, who described the lasting impact of Dennis's actions. Frank testified about his father's humiliation and how it had contributed to his decline. Dennis was given a chance to speak. He stood and addressed the court, saying he accepted responsibility for his actions and was deeply sorry. He said he'd been attending substance abuse counseling and learning about his gambling addiction. He said he wanted to make amends and become someone his daughter could be proud of. Judge Ramirez listened without expression. When Dennis finished, she said she'd reviewed everything carefully, including the pre-sentencing reports and character statements. She said while she appreciated Dennis's stated remorse, his pattern of behavior suggested a calculated predator rather than someone with an addiction or mental health issue. She said Dennis had targeted multiple vulnerable people over many years, that he'd shown no inclination to change until forced by legal consequences. She sentenced Dennis to 3 years in state prison on the elder abuse charge, with sentences for the other charges to run concurrently. She also ordered him to pay $4,400 in restitution, the total amount he'd stolen from or extorted from Grandma when combining civil and criminal judgments. She ordered that upon release, Dennis would serve 5 years of supervised probation with strict conditions, including continued therapy, complete prohibition from working with or living with elderly or vulnerable adults, and mandatory financial monitoring. Dennis was led away in handcuffs. He looked back once at the courtroom, but Grandma wasn't there to see it. She'd chosen not to attend the sentencing, saying she'd said everything she needed to say at the previous hearings. Life slowly returned to normal after that. I continued living with Grandma for another year before moving into my own place nearby. Claire visited monthly and eventually moved back to our hometown, buying a house 3 miles from Grandma's place. We established a routine of family dinners every week, rotating between our homes. Grandma started volunteering with Rita's support group, helping newly identified elder abuse victims navigate the legal and emotional recovery process. She became an advocate, speaking at community events about warning signs and prevention. She said if her horrible experience could help protect even one other family, then something good had come from it. She also reconnected with some of Dennis's extended family members who'd been unaware of what he'd done. Many expressed shock and apologized for not seeing the signs. Grandma told them there was nothing to apologize for, that Dennis had been skilled at hiding his true nature. One evening, about a year after Dennis went to prison, Grandma asked me to go to the attic with her. We climbed the narrow stairs, and she showed me a wooden box I'd never seen before. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Dennis from Aunt Linda during her final year of life. Grandma said Linda had been terrified of dying and leaving Dennis alone because she knew he couldn't take care of himself. She'd written letter after letter, trying to teach him how to be responsible, how to manage money, how to treat people with respect. Grandma had found them in Dennis's old bedroom at Linda's house after the funeral. Most were still sealed, never opened. Dennis had never read his dying mother's attempts to help him become a better person. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.